Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to see you all here, and I'm very excited to be part of this field school, and hope we will have a very exciting time in the next 2 weeks. In this talk, I would like to share with you my experience as an anthropologist working with small local community museums in Thailand. And that may be the background of how this field school was conceived, initiated, and how it's operated. So what I hope to do in this short talk is, the first thing I want to give an overview of how museums in Thailand have developed and how the concepts and expression of museums have shifted in recent years. And secondly, I want to touch a little bit, not too much because we'll hear more about that in the series of lectures that will follow. I want to touch a little bit about culture, folk culture, and the notion of cultural heritage, even before the introduction of the concept of intangible cultural heritage by UNESCO. And lastly, we'll come to why we should pay attention to museums and intangible cultural heritage now, and what roles you people who may be museum curators, cultural practitioners, researchers can play in making linkages between museums and intangible cultural heritage. So first, what is a museum in the Thai context? Well, I think we have to start with official discourse of museum, which traces its origin to royal collection. The term in Thai for museum is pipithapan, and as we have people from 12 different countries and probably many languages, I think you all have different terms for the English museum, right? I don't know. I don't know in Lao. คำลาวว่าอะไรคะพิพิธภัณฑ์ similar to Thai. How about in other place in Bhutan? What is the museum? What is the word for museum in Bhutan? In Bhutanese, Dzongkha. What does it mean? Showcase of
traditional artifacts.
Of artifacts. Okay. Yes. Well, you all have different words, and I'm eager to learn what words you use for museum in your language and what it means. Well, the word pithappan, the Thai word that is now used as a word for museum, is said to have been taken from the name of a royal palace. The palace was built in 1859 to house royal collections, which King Rama IV, who built the palace, showed to ambassadors, diplomats, and high-ranking Siamese. The term actually means various objects or various materials or a variety of objects. So it focuses on objects and a collection of objects. Originally, it was the king's collection, and it was exclusive to ambassadors and high-ranking officials or nobilities, princes, very important people. But then in the 19th century, at that time, the word pipithapan wasn't so well known, and in fact, we used the English word museum, but pronounce it in the Thai way as museum or museum for collection. So the first time that the royal collection were temporarily opened in the royal palace, and this is the actual building where these collections were displayed, happened in 1874. And most of the things displayed are jewelry, royal regalia, and a number of treasures that the kings have collected or have been given by foreign dignitaries. At that time, in the 19th century, because of the ideas that the Siamese got from Western people, Western scholars, or sometimes administrators in colonial countries. Museum was seen, perceived as marker of civilization. You have a museum in your country in order to show that you are a civilized country. You have these treasures, you have these artifacts to show that you are a country with advanced art and archaeology. So that is the kind of the passion of the museum in the 19th century. And until 1980, when the royal after the 19th century, the royal collections were transferred to the National Museum, which were established around the 1930, 1940. And up until 1980s, the National Museums represent the only museum landscape in Thailand. So when you think of museum in Thailand, you think of national museums. And the purpose of the national museums, and you can read the quotes that are taken from the official website of the National Museum of Thailand. The purpose of the National Museum is to collect, classify, catalog, and display archaeological and artistic artifacts collected and acquired by the museums. So the focus is on archaeological and artistic artifacts almost exclusively. There have been some changes recently, but predominantly archaeological and artistic. But in the 1980s, something very important happened to the museum landscape in Thailand. This is too complicated to explain in few words, but there is a phenomenon that sometimes referred to informally as museum fever or museum boom. The phenomenon is the growth in the number of museums. And if you look at this chart, a simple chart, you can see that museums started around 1930. And until about today, the National Museum, there are only about 44 museums. But altogether, we have, according to Kun Paritta, who takes care of the local museum database, we have over 1,200 museums of different kinds, of all kinds, in Thailand. So it's a kind of an explosion of museum that happened around 1980. And a lot of museums that were initiated and established in the 1980s were small museums. You can call them local museums or community-based museums. The terms are not stable yet. But these are little museums that happened in the 1980s. And there are a number of factors that explain the explosion of this museum, like economic growth, rural and urban development, growth of civil society, as well as new perspective of heritage that is going on in Thailand. So just take a brief look at, a diversity of small museums in Thailand. Some of them commemorate some important Buddhist monks. Some are kind of folk museum. Some are open site for archaeological findings. Some are collections of things in the monastery. Some are local craft, like this is a museum of earthenware and ceramics. And some collect seashells. Quite a few of them are ethnic museums, expressing the identity of many different ethnic groups in Thailand, like the Hill Tribe Museums, the Hmong Museum, the Sea Gypsy or the Chalermpow Museum in the south, or the Puan ethnic group in central Thailand, for example. And to kind of capture the shift or the transformation that have been happening in the past 2 or 3 decades. This is a very crude summary, but you can see that there is a shift from museums that are exclusively state-run, national museum, to museums that are run by monasteries, schools, communities, and individuals. There is a shift from museums that are object-based to museums that are based on stories, people, a kind of a wider interest than archaeological and artistic artifacts. there is a shift from expert knowledge that Ajahn Alex talked about to knowledge, to valuation or honoring of knowledge from folk people, laymen, community, common people, knowledge of the common people. There is a shift from the focus on the antiquities, that is archaeological findings, high art, to something very, very diverse, everyday objects, folk crafts, ethnic artifacts, and including museums without objects. You'll hear about that later, virtual museums that only exist on the internet, for example. And lastly, there is a shift from the aim or the purpose of museum to conserve, to classify, to catalog, to a new purpose of a broader agenda than just museum. And that is the agenda of community development and empowerment of community members in order to safeguard their heritage and display what they consider valuable for them. So these are some of the shifts that are, this is quite simplistic. The real reality is more complicated than this, but this is, just to show you. So bear in mind that the purpose of the museum that you saw earlier, stated by the National Museum, is to collect, to classify, to catalog. Let's look at the purpose of the museum. And this is the latest one. I just took it from the newspaper. It's the museum that's being opened in Satoon. That is one of the Muslim communities in the southernmost region of Thailand. It's called the Muslim Way of Life Museum. And it is stated, well, according to newspaper anyway, the Muslim Way of Life Museum is one instrument to communicate with members of the community. Note, members of the community, not tourists, not visitors, and encourage them to appreciate the value of living in moderation. This is something that Thai people talk about all the time now. The museum aims to collect stories of customs, culture, local way of life. It aims to make young people feel attached to their home village. Some of the handicrafts have been forgotten. By putting them in the museum, the children will get to know them, appreciate, and safeguard them rather than neglect them. So these are the statements that new museums put forward for explaining their existence, their rationale, what museums are for. So moving on a little bit, we've talked about museums and the shift that's happening in museum landscape. I would like to talk a little bit briefly about intangible cultural heritage. In fact, the term ICH is something that I find very difficult to pronounce. It's always cumbersome and a mouthful, and so if I don't pronounce it correctly, or if I say ICH, you know what I mean. But I like to note that, ICH is a new term. It sounds like something that been recently introduced. But I would like to point out that the notion or the understanding of heritage in the sense of something that is valuable to you, something that you would like to pass on to the next generation, is older than the term ICH. And I'm sure that in your own culture, in your language, you have terms that may be translated into ICH or, fit into ICH somewhat. And in Thailand, there are places or there are sites like Buddhist monasteries. This is just one example, but there are other sites as well that have always functioned as a storage for a collection of things, like museums do. So Buddhist monasteries collect religious and lay artifacts, things like Buddha images, relics, manuscripts, ceremonial objects, utensils. When you visit museums that, during your tour this afternoon, you'll see some of these things in the museum. But they don't collect only material objects. Buddhist monasteries are a site where cultural knowledge, both religious and lay knowledge, things like art and crafts and medicine, are transferred from one generation to the next. So in the old days, if a guy wanted to be educated, and when there were no schools, no government schools, no modern schools, he went into the monastery to be educated. And in Thai, we say that a guy who had, passed through the education in Buddhist monastery will turn from a raw person to a cooked person, a person who is mature, a person who is ready to start a family. So it's in traditional cultural space like Buddhist monastery, tangible and intangible, material and non-material, objects and non-objects are not separated. They're not split, they're not divided into the tangible and the intangible cultural heritage. So I would like you to bear in mind that. And when you apply some of the things that you have learned in this course, in this training workshop to your work, I hope that you will bear in mind that there is no divide in the tangible and the intangible in traditional knowledge.